All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, the CEO of the committee. Our subject today is disruption and innovation in a post-COVID age, where we will be hearing from Ravi Gurumurthy, who's the new CEO of Nesta. For those who don't know, Nesta is a UK-based foundation focused entirely on innovation. It's, in my personal opinion, one of the most interesting organizations in the world. So you'll hear a little bit about Nesta as part of the introduction, I hope. Ravi joined Nesta as chief executive in December of 2019. So like any of you that took a job toward the end of last year, you did not know you were going to be spending it focused on COVID and the aftermath, but that's true for all of us. He previously worked for the International Rescue Committee, responsible for their work in designing, testing, and scaling products and services for people affected by crisis of various kinds in over 40 countries. Prior to that, Ravi held a number of roles in the UK government, including Director of Strategy at the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and was a strategic advisor to the Foreign Secretary. So the way this works is Ravi will give his talk. Then I will moderate the Q&A. You submit your questions via the Q&A app on Zoom, and I will sort through them. And let's get on with it. Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Great to be able to join you here. As you said, I didn't really expect to be quite in this situation when I joined the organisation. However, having spent quite a few years working in a humanitarian organisation responding to crises, the whole COVID response feels strangely familiar to me, although I was hoping to be able to escape from it. What I thought I'd try and do today is talk a little bit, first of all, about Nesta. I'll give a few introductory remarks about what we do, and then talk about what are the different scenarios that we've been looking at for how we respond to COVID and the aftermath, and how we can potentially shape that future. Let me just begin by sharing my screen. 1 second. Great. So first of all, Nesta. As Gabriel said, Nesta is an innovation foundation. Our mission is to try to support and promote and develop innovations that have a societal benefit. And we work in a whole range of different areas, from healthcare to education to addressing economic challenges and climate change. We are currently rethinking, obviously, what we do, as every organization is in this transition, and thinking about how we can focus our efforts on the biggest social challenges that we face. And typically, what we do is look across what we call the innovation spiral. So everything from this point one here, looking at the opportunities and challenges, mapping the future, through to generating ideas, prototyping them, but also trying to get all the way through to scaling and shifting systems. Because we do know that so many innovations start off, but they get stillborn and they don't end up becoming, they don't diffuse to the whole system. So we're as active in the latter stages of the innovation spiral as the former. Right now, we're probably doing quite a lot of the work at the beginning of the spiral, thinking through how has COVID changed some of the drivers of change and the opportunities and challenges that we face. And that's what I was going to focus on today. As I said, my background is actually most recently working in a humanitarian crisis. And one of the things that is very striking about every innovation, every crisis that I've seen, is that it's a great forcer of innovation. Scarcity forces people to innovate in a way that they don't normally do, particularly because it unblocks the demand side. Often there are technologies and ways of working that are very available, like using Zoom, but the penetration, diffusion of that technology is stuck because of all sorts of habits or vested interests. And therefore, innovation can often leap forward in a crisis because the inertia and institutional constraints are removed. And the first thing that Nesta has been doing is trying to help frontline organizations respond to the crisis. So we've been working, for instance, with the National Health Service on how you shift rapidly all of their services from face-to-face appointments with doctors through to digital online means. And it's interesting here that the National Health Service had a target to shift to digital by 2024, and they've managed to achieve that in just a few weeks due to COVID. And now the question that they're facing is how do they lock in those changes so that we don't go back after COVID to just face-to-face appointments and lose the productivity benefits, the convenience benefits of being able to see a doctor from your home. We've also been working quite a lot with the education department and schools on edtech platforms and how we can, first of all, bring some more rigor to a sector that is full of lots of interesting innovations, but lacks a lot of proof about what works. So that's an example of some of the work we've been doing. What's interesting is that some of the innovations that we funded and supported many, many years ago are turning out to have a very, very useful role in the current crisis. So Good Sam is an organization that only involves a very small number of people, but they are the organization that was responsible for recruiting over 750,000 people to be volunteers to the National Health Service during COVID. It's a great example of how sometimes the progress of innovations are so non-linear, and you can think that an idea is a good idea, but a small idea, and then the time comes when it really starts to scale and take off. As we look to the post-coronavirus future, we've been thinking about all the different scenarios that could play out. As you can imagine, there's huge uncertainty, no one really knows, but I think it is useful to try and paint a picture of the different directions that we could go in, partly to look at some of the common elements. So are there some recurring features of different scenarios that we know we should plan on, but also to try and look at what are the different options that we need to actively cultivate if we're going to keep them alive. And the four scenarios that we've been thinking about are a return to normal, a permanent state of emergency, a post-coronavirus settlement, and Big Brothers. And let me just say a little bit about each of them. So first of all, the return to normal. I think we can often underestimate both the desire amongst citizens and others to return to normal, and also the capacity of systems to bounce back. And when they do bounce back, they often can find the same groove that they were in before. So in a UK perspective, given the huge support that the Treasury has provided to people and businesses, including a huge furlough scheme that is basically providing 80% of wages for anyone who's not able to work, it is possible that substantial parts of the economy don't go under and that the life support machine works, and that we are able gradually to start getting back to normal. I think it's likely to be a heightened normal, if you like. So many of the trends that we saw prior to this crisis are likely to be accelerated, like the shift towards digital services or the move online for all shopping. Even some of the more geopolitical trends, I think, are just likely to be heightened by this current crisis. For instance, the US-China tensions or the rise of authoritarianism. Many of those things were happening and in train for many years, and we just might find ourselves in a hyper-normal state. I think the second obvious scenario is that this is almost a permanent state of emergency. Again, in my previous life, what you often found was that a crisis occurred and it became a protracted crisis, or one that kept fluctuating in and out. And one can see this happening in a number of ways. First of all, what started off as a health crisis is already an economic crisis, and it may well become a political crisis in many places, so it might metastasize. But also, in some ways, if you look back over the last 10 years, 15 years, one can see that we've been in a series of different crisis situations. And by crisis, I mean when the state and state capacity and institutions are overwhelmed by the nature of the situation and the demands on it. So over the last 15 years, having gone from a financial and economic crisis through to the global refugee crisis and the crisis of European migrants, through to Brexit in the UK, it's felt like our political institutions have been under unprecedented strain. And that's before we face things like climate change and rising natural disasters. So it is possible that we see perpetual shocks and that the reserve powers of the state that have been created through COVID never get fully unwound. And we are in this permanent state. Obviously, that is something that is highly undesirable. And that in turn could be the reason why you end up in this third scenario, what we're calling a post-coronavirus settlement. And this in some ways is analogous to what happened during and after the Second World War, when a sense of solidarity, but also enlightened self-interest, made countries and people within countries try to carve out new institutional frameworks, new business models that actually cope with the new demands that were being placed on society and the state. And I think this bucket is one where most people are likely to project their desired future rather than the real future. But I think it is absolutely right that we are thinking through how the disruption that we are seeing can be harnessed and be used to try to address some of the longer term causes of instability and move towards a more positive future. There is, of course, a fourth scenario, which we're highlighting here, which is what we're calling big brothers. And that's a future where many of the trends towards concentration of power, concentration of money, are exacerbated. So if you imagine who comes out well from this crisis, it may well be that the bigger companies survive. We could see society more prepared to tolerate surveillance, because that's the price to pay to avoid another resurgence of the virus. And we could see many democratic countries struggle, particularly compared to how some of the authoritarian regimes are able to deal with this crisis. So I think it's a perfectly plausible scenario to see surveillance capitalism, larger organizations survive well out of this crisis. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is, well, which of these things are more likely? Where are we like to see the most obvious change happening at a more micro level? I would say that all of those scenarios are things that I can imagine happening. They may happen in different countries. They may happen in the same country, different elements of them. And it may not be linear. So for instance, right now, from a geopolitical perspective, you can see how US-China relations are getting more tense. Donald Trump is able to interpret this crisis as a reason to strengthen borders, to strengthen all of his previous policies. But equally, it may well be the undoing of him, and one could see a Biden government obviously trying to strengthen some of the institutions that address globalization, strengthen the WHO. So although I think that these scenarios are all plausible, I would also say, let's not judge what happens now, because it may take many, many years for these different trends to play out. But when I think about where is disruption the most likely, particularly at a more micro level, I'd say a few things. Firstly, where is COVID breaking business models and political settlements? So right now, to give you an example of universities, in the UK, about £5 billion comes in from foreign students' tuition fees to British universities. That's about a third of tuition fee revenue. So all of our universities now are facing a major reckoning, not least because they've all had to shift their work online. So a new model of provision is becoming more accepted. So the combination of funding crunch and online could well see a big shift in universities. And government may well engineer that, because if they do bail out universities, they could well make it conditional on certain changes. Our high streets are also ones that I think could see the business models of the past being revealed as being no longer fit for purpose. So many of our high street chains were already pretty much underwater and were closing. This whole process will probably accelerate that. Many people will not go back to shopping as we knew it. Airlines, for obvious reasons. Insurance schemes, again, many parts of the economy may well be uninsurable. What kind of innovation will we need there? Or what kinds of public-private partnerships are going to be needed? even I put taxation here because at some point, many countries, particularly outside the US, are going to find the limits of printing money and have to think about how they put in place credible plans to address the deficits. And here's where one could imagine governments and politicians finding different ways to tax in a more legitimate way. For instance, could they tax unearned wealth or carbon as opposed to taxing labor, particularly at a time when they're trying to incentivize new job creation? I think another area where COVID could potentially create disruption is where the level of injustice is so much that it shifts these structural incentives. So the level of outrage at the way in which older people have been treated in the UK in care homes, where we've seen a huge outbreak of coronavirus, I think is creating a deep sense of injustice and a belief that it's not acceptable that we treat so many people in this way. And for many, many years, there's been calls on a totally different way of funding social care. And one can imagine those calls gaining momentum in the next few weeks and months, and the pressure being overwhelming. I think the third area is one where COVID can create fault lines that political entrepreneurs can exploit. So there's clearly going to be a big desire to build back better. That's what every single politician around the world will try to argue. But can politicians use this moment to exploit the current situation and pivot attitudes in a certain direction? So you could imagine saying, there is a need to build back. Why don't we build back in a better way? We've got to totally renovate our housing stock anyway to cope with climate change. Let's accelerate that. And it will become more possible and plausible to do that. More negatively, a lot of political entrepreneurs will try to activate us-them boundaries and create divisions and say, for instance, that we have to take a tougher line on immigrants. And it's obviously easier to blame a clearly identified enemy rather than try to bring societies together. And that's what I think we have to obviously be aware of. In terms of how do we shape this change rather than just observe it, I'd say two ways in which I think there may be limitations to how we currently think about this. First of all, the obvious tendency is to reach towards some elite-led process. So an individual like a William Beveridge in the UK, or a commission to try and make recommendations about how society should be reformed. And the challenge with that is, first of all, there are fewer authority figures for whom people have deference. So it's not obvious who the grandees are who would pronounce the future. Secondly, those elite-led commissions have to be invited in by governments or the establishment, and governments have to be open to that change. And then I think the third point here is that an alternative approach is to try to invite citizens in a more participative way. But many of those processes often go nowhere, and for similar reasons actually to the elite-led commission. First of all, if they're not actually invited in, then how do they get traction? How do they get listened to? And many of these processes can often take a lot of time, be quite costly, involve relatively few people, and therefore not have the ability to break down the door if they've not already been invited in. So I do think that what we need to see is some innovations in what we call collective intelligence, the ways in which people come together and use digital means to harness the wisdom of the crowd. And one of the areas that Nesta is looking at is, can we use a combination of experts, citizens, to participate in ways of shaping the future and imagine the future? There are lots and lots of different ideas that one could talk about in that space, but I do think that the standard mechanisms of a citizens' jury or a commission are not really necessarily the way in which we're going to get traction on shaping any of the scenarios that I've set out. I'm going to stop there and hand back over to Gabriel, and I think we're going to have some questions.
All right, Ravi, thank you very much. And everybody feel free to submit questions via the Q&A app, and we'll sort through those. So, Ravi, the 4 scenarios are very provocative. We actually linked to those in our readers group email that we sent out last week. Based on what you see at this point, what are the forces that you see emerging as maybe the most impactful on I mean, I know it's too soon to say how it's going to go, but
Yeah.
the drivers that seem to be having the most impact at this point?
So I think what's interesting about the 3 of the 4 scenarios is that they all represent forms of continuity. So return to normal is about going back, obviously, to the past. Even the permanent emergency is just assuming that the crisis is protracted and metastasizes. And then the the Big Brother's side of things is almost just extending some of the negative trends around authoritarianism and concentration of power. And I am largely negative about the fallout from this crisis, because I think the central case is probably that we have a heightened form of normal, that most of the society does go back to how it was, but some of the trends that were set in train many years ago are just accelerated. And if you assume that many of those are not necessarily positive, then I think we're in a fairly negative situation. So just to give you one example of a negative one, many people suggest that coronavirus is going to be good for climate change, because obviously it's opened up ways of working that involve distance working and digital means, and it's suspended the economies. But right now, energy investment in green technologies will be collapsing. And that has such a long and far-reaching effect that it may well be difficult to get the kind of scale of investment needed in new energy technologies to meet our carbon reduction goals.
Here in Australia, it's been so striking how much the government that has not been excited about taking action on climate change, as you would know, has in fact done everything that would be necessary, has listened to science, has communicated complicated issues to the public, has asked people to make a shared sacrifice, has funded at a very large scale social welfare programs for people who are going to be impacted, has built a cooperative framework between the states and the Commonwealth government, just kind of on and on and on. All of the very hardest things that make it so difficult to take on climate change have been demonstrated. And so certainly people here hope that it's not just the experiment in low mobility living, but it's the kind of building the muscle of collective action might be able to get applied to climate change. Do you think there's a chance of that, or is that naive?
I do think there is some chance of that, and that this has stretched people's sense of what is possible. And it's also created a very stark image of what crisis looks like for generations of people who've not actually experienced that. So I think politicians will be able to say climate change is going to be akin to a new crisis that you've just seen. And we know that we can, as a society, innovate at speed, make sacrifices. We're not asking you to make the scale of sacrifice you've just made. We're actually looking to plan this out and manage it. So I think it's possible if politicians want to use it. My concern is that we don't necessarily have the nucleus of leaders who want to use this crisis for progressive means. And therefore, without some action from society, from leaders or citizens, this moment may not be seized and captured for the reasons, in the way that you want it to be.
Right. I mean, many people have made the observation that out of the crisis of the 1930s, we saw both things like the New Deal in America and European fascism emerge as responses to the crisis. The crisis does not bear a directionality within it of what the response is.
No, I mean, exactly that. And that's why you're going to see probably different responses at different times in the same countries, or different countries going in different directions. I do think it's worth asking ourselves, what will change the direction of your society? You know, will it really cause a pivot rather than just accelerate pre-existing trends? And I largely think that it will accelerate things that were going on already, rather than be genuinely disruptive.
Yes. That idea that you spoke to, that in a crisis, innovation is accelerated, but it's things that already were in motion. It's just so hard to know, because in any one moment, there's so many things in motion, so many trends that are in fact countervailing trends. So which one will be accelerated?
Exactly. So, I mean, it's perfectly possible that you just boost one current in society that was in tension with another, and it slightly tips the balance, and that's where positive openings can come up. I totally agree.
Ravi, it's been very fascinating from this perch in Sydney to see how see how America has fared for me, but to watch the UK, and to observe just how much harder London has been hit by COVID than Sydney or any of the cities in Australia. What is the best thinking from people at Nesta at this point about the lessons for the UK, about what was done right and wrong?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. Until 6 months ago, I was in New York for the last 6 years. So watching both New York and London hit incredibly hard has been very sobering and sad. And one of the lessons I think that will come from this crisis is the British and American sense of exceptionalism is totally unjustified. Britain was later on in the cycle in terms of the spread of the virus. So Italy and Spain and other European countries were already ahead and locking down. And even though Italy was locking down, we were carrying on, saying that we'll only lock down if we need to, and maybe later on. And there was this sense that actually we were different, and that we had the best scientists and the people who can manage this crisis. So humility, I think, will hopefully be a more profound lesson from this crisis. The other ones are more obvious and prosaic, which are we need to have proper systems of track and trace that are up and running and able to be switched on for the next pandemic. And it's obviously true that those societies which were exposed to SARS and MERS, like South Korea, they both had the muscle memory and the technology to be able to respond quickly. And one hopes that that will be something that is a legacy. What is sad both about the UK and US situation is that probably 10, 15 years ago, both countries had done a lot on pandemic preparedness, both under the Obama administration and the Labour administration. I would say that we were considered to be ahead of other countries. And the loss of institutional memory in both countries, not least due to austerity in the UK, has been sort of very depressing. So the need to maintain spare capacity and not treat it as a luxury is going to be really, really important. I mean, just to amplify on one point on there, if you compare the UK and Germany, which I think is a very instructive comparison, the UK has far less intensive care beds. So it's actually, Germany has 5 times more ICU beds than the UK. And as a result, they've had the spare capacity to be able to potentially admit people earlier. They've not needed to protect their health system in the way that we have. And we don't know what's behind German mortality rates being much better than UK's, but one potential thesis is that spare capacity, which allowed them to treat differently and earlier.
Right. You learn a lot about the underlying functioning of the health system in a time like this. Just like in a normal recession, you learn a lot about the underlying functioning of the economy. And I mean, it's interesting for the United States, where the big hope is that this finally leads to healthcare
Yeah.
for Americans. Of course, that's not a binary state. Once you, quote, have healthcare, you are in the middle of a world of policy debates that will go on forever about how that should be structured and what gets paid for, and
Yeah.
all the many, many questions that people in America are not familiar with, because those haven't started yet.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting in America to see whether this is so devastating that it changes the debate in a significant way around healthcare. I think that's perfectly possible. In terms of the lessons, I think this whole crisis shows the need for state capacity and why state capacity is needed. But it also, I think, shows the dangers of centralized state capacity as well, in that the way in which we've sometimes responded with the army shipping PPE equipment around, I don't think has been the most efficient or effective way of responding. So state capacity, but finding ways of decentralizing decision making may well be the thing that comes out from this.
I'm going to read this question that just came in. If we can't rely on leadership from politicians, which depends on the country, whether you can or can't, how do you use this opportunity to build better bridges at a community level for change that we may now have more of an appetite for? I think this is trying to speak to your final slide about the move from elite-led
Yeah.
investigation to collective intelligence, perhaps.
Yeah. So I think what's been really interesting about the crisis is that whereas normal modes of participation are highly demanding of citizen time, it involves people going to meetings in the evening, and whereas this crisis has actually been quite lean in the way in which it has created mutual assistance and social action. So people are collaborating online, they're doing things in an efficient way, and therefore you are getting to much greater scale than I think you traditionally have done with lots of community action. The question for me is, how does that bridge into political decision making and governmental institutions? And that's where local leaders, local political leaders can play a critical role. They can potentially innovate in letting those new sources of energy enter the decision-making process. So once you have got active local groups, why not engage with them in decisions about how you build back, or how do you actually manage the next phase of the crisis? It will be in the interests of politicians to probably do that, to show that they're listening and engaging, but it actually might sow some really interesting institutional links between government and civil society.
Ravi, does COVID mean anything for Brexit? Or are those just on separate tracks?
Well, you would think that having just been through such an awful crisis, you would not want another disruption to your trading links, which is only 6 months away. All the noises from government are that they do not want to extend the transition period, because we've already Brexited, but there is a question about whether we now leave the single market with a deal or with no deal. It's very, very hard to see how the negotiations can happen in time to get a deal by the end of the year. But the government is very much saying that they're not going to extend the deadline. Something's got to give. I find it hard to imagine that when we are in a very deep recession, at that point, it's going to feel sensible to hit the economy with another shock. So either some sort of rapid compromise and rapid deal because it's in everyone's interests, or some sort of extension feels more likely to me than a complete no deal situation. But the current government have been pretty unpredictable in how they've handled Brexit over the last year.
Another question about global relationships. There's a lot of wondering about whether the countries that have handled this better end up in a different position in the global order. So that would include the Asian democracies. It also would include include the Asian, some of the Asian authoritarian countries. It also would include places like Australia and New Zealand. So some very different models that thus far, and we say this without trying to be hubristic, but thus far seem to have handled things better. Do you foresee a different stature or status as a result of that?
Well, as I said earlier, I think this will be humbling for the US and for UK and for parts of Europe. So it may well reset our views about soft power. Maybe more countries like Australia and New Zealand or South Korea will have soft power, particularly around how you reform the state and the state institutions. That could well be enduring. But I think the key with, for instance, the US is the soft power is combined with hard power, and that's how it really affects a lot of change. So while I think it's true to say that lots of people in this country will be looking to some of the countries I mentioned rather fondly, I'm not sure where that goes and how that actually translates into real meaningful change. Yeah.
Yeah. The prediction about the decoupling of supply lines from China as a de-risking strategy, how far do you think that goes in terms of bringing manufacturing to more expensive countries?
So, yes, it's interesting. One of the future scenarios was always reshoring more economic activity through robots and automation, but I never really saw how you'd get the disruption that would bring it back. But it was always a plausible hypothesis. I think this will, at the margin, potentially allow that to happen. I think the question will be, will the investment be feasible to actually make that happen? So this is where I think there will be some interesting choices for governments. Do they try to make big strategic bets on bringing back certain capacity, either under the, and this may be where COVID is used as a bit of a excuse for blatant protectionism, but one could imagine government trying to strategically reorient their economy in a way that brings back activity to make it more resilient. I'm still, again, a little bit skeptical that will happen given the sheer scale of what we've got already. So, but perhaps at the margin, it may do.
This decoupling of the world from China would be such a fundamental restructuring of the economy. It's hard to imagine really carrying that forward.
I mean, this is where I think the return to normal is most likely, in the sense that it's too entrenched, it's too much in everyone's interest for that to unravel, and it's very, very dangerous for all sides. So there is a mutual self-interest in getting relatively back to normal.
Ravi, maybe just a final line of questioning to pick up on your scenarios. Let's talk about the post-COVID settlement. You are intellectually being careful to not presume that your preferences are how it's going to turn out. But what would it take for things to go the right way? What needs to happen for what to you would be the best outcome in that settlement to emerge?
$1 million question. So I think the first thing is that politicians actually have to let the public in. So if I was in government right now, I'd want to be saying, let's have the biggest national conversation about national renewal possible. We're all having conversations and virtual dinner parties on Zoom. Why don't we have 1 million people in the next 3 months have a conversation about what the future should look like? And let's also accept that what we've learned from this crisis is that expertise matters, not just people. So let's have a dialogue between the public and experts who are curating this conversation, offering up different alternatives to debate and discuss. So I think that the only way in which we can get a really positive settlement is if the public and experts are highly engaged in a process of deliberation and in a way that feels fun rather than worthy. So it's perfectly possible, I think, to create a bit of a movement where people want to talk to people they don't know about how to emerge from this crisis better in ways that are meaningful and relevant to them. So that's the first thing. I think more practically, it requires government to see this as an opportunity to go from this being a crisis mindset to how can we solve some of the underlying tensions and problems that all societies are now facing, whether that's climate change or lack of housing or the weakness of our democratic institutions or the way in which we treat immigrants. Those are all big issues that it's possible to say, let's grasp, let's find a settlement, let's find a way of dealing with that tension rather than it being a simmering one, and let's lock it in part through a massive process of deliberation.
One of the reasons why the word settlement is so evocative is it implies a sort of a grand bargain where it's not the same thing as you get exactly what you want. It's a new configuration where enough interests get enough of what they want that it becomes stable and hopefully better for everybody. But it's very different from your personal wish list all happening.
Yeah.
Do you see any possibility for settlements, and what would some of those be? The classic post-war settlement between capital and labor about high rates of unionization and high wages, but a very stable workforce that gave a lot to make it work for capital as well. I mean, what does that look like today?
Yeah. Well, I sort of point to two. One around how we treat old people, and the second is around how we treat workers. And if you assume that you can't go back to a world of exceptionally stable employment and rising pay, how do you deal with precarious work? And this is where you could imagine new welfare institutions emerging. So can people, for instance, join an intermediary that provides them with the training and career security that they want, but it actually involves them being loaned out to different employers and create some security out of what is essentially a gig economy. And that's where the reason I think that's an interesting example is that you can imagine that actually being beneficial to the Deliveroos and gig economy companies if done in the right way. So it could be in their interests because you're externalizing some of the things that normal companies provided. And that's where I think, a citizen interest and a company interest could come together. Similarly, with aging, you could imagine us asking more of family members and extended family members in terms of care for the elderly, while the state steps in with more funding, but also asks individuals to set aside more money for elderly care. It will require a bargain between all parts of society, but now is the moment to potentially strike that when the sense of outrage at the status quo is great.
All right, a final question. And quite a few questions have come in just trying to think about climate and how that relates to COVID. And maybe one thing is that from the perspective of Australia, people here are just so fascinated with how did the Tories become in favor of taking climate action? Like, how did it become a bipartisan issue in the UK? It's so different here. But so this question about can we learn anything? Can we apply anything from this experience of collective sacrifice that has happened to flatten the curve of COVID to the collective action needed for climate change? And what would it look like to do that?
Yeah. So just on your first point about how the Tories ended up being in favour of this, what happened was in the mid-2000s, David Cameron, the Tory leader, realised he had to detoxify the image of the Tories as the nasty party, as it was known, and chose climate change as the issue to show that the Tories cared. And what he did cleverly was create a bit of a arms race on the environment domestically. And it's out of that that we actually got the Climate Change Act in the UK, because when the Tories decided to make climate change the spearhead of their rebranding, Labour responded by trying to outflank them, and we legislated for the Climate Change Act very, very quickly. And that then locked in a cross-party consensus on that legislation, which even during austerity and a lot of Tories saying, what the hell are we doing putting up energy taxes, we still ended up making massive investments in green energy and sticking to our climate change commitments in the UK. So that's the background on that. And I think what that shows is the ability to create moments which lock in action later on. So if you did, out of this period, say, let's never go back to these 4 things, let's lock in big change. And by the way, for instance, let's take buildings and housing, which is the next big wave of energy reduction that the UK needs to do. We need to basically rip out 25 million boilers in people's homes and replace it with low carbon heating. Why doesn't the government basically accelerate that transition? I think if you did that on a cross-party basis in particular, it would stick. So it comes back to this point about crises allow political entrepreneurs to reshape things, but they have to have the ambition to do that and feel that there is a political interest in it. So if the Tories felt that by doing that they can steal a lot of Labour voters, that's how I think it might happen. It has to be in their naked political interest to do so.
All right, Ravi, thank you for getting up early and sharing some time with us. Very interesting. We are following Nesta's work quite carefully here. Yeah, not what you thought you were going to get probably for your first year on leading the organization, but thank you for everything you're doing on this. Everybody else, thank you for tuning in to Committee for Sydney Live, and we'll see you at the next one. Okay.